All right, starting to see some really exciting use cases in the chat. Some folks who are starting to set up segment and also folks who are interested to use data to drive ROI. Really great use cases that I think everyone here on the panel would be thrilled to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and start kicking things off. We'll still have a couple people joining, but wanted to say hello and welcome to our Stacked meetup today. Thanks so much for joining and taking the time to dive into building a modern data stack. So this series in particular came about after working with a key group of Segment customers last year, back when we could still get together in cities around the world, and they shared some stories on how their marketing stack had evolved to solve specific business problems. The feedback from those early meetups were resounding, "We want to see more," which sparked Stacked, a series we're running globally to help like-minded companies come together and learn from one another. Sharing Stacked stories virtually allows for so much more engagement for all of you. So I'm very excited to have everyone here today, and also wanted to give a special thanks to our partners at Mixpanel and Tray.io for joining us today. So before we begin, quick note about questions. We will have dedicated time at the end to answer questions, and we encourage you to submit them by using the Q&A button you'll see in your Zoom toolbar. Feel free to get specific about business problems that you're going to hear about, as well as broader questions around Segment, Mixpanel, and Tray.io that you might have. If you'd like to hear from a specific speaker, you can also let us know, and you'll be able to upvote questions to help us prioritize what we get to first. Now, to get started, this is probably a pretty familiar slide to most of you. Over the past 8 years, the marketing tech landscape has ballooned from 150 to over 7,000 tools. Tools that help us to unify and optimize the experience for our customers, and who wouldn't want that? So to get started today, I'm Taylor, and I'm a partner marketing manager at Segment. I think about these tools day in and day out as they relate to our partner integrations at Segment. And I'm excited to host with my peers Bella from Tray.io and Jazz from Mixpanel. We're going to hear how Tray.io evolved its tech stack and approach to build a model for customer retention at scale. So here's the problem. We all want to put our customers first. We all want to make data-driven product decisions. But to do that, we have to acknowledge that there are many touch points along the customer journey. And I'm sure most of you would agree, collecting that customer data and perfecting the experience with the right set of tools is an uphill battle. When we take a look at how most customers went about building their stack, there's a noticeable pattern. You start with the basics, setting up an analytics tool. And as your company grows, you outgrow a tool like Google Analytics and augment it with something more powerful. Next, as you're getting a better sense of your customer behaviors, you want to implement personalized onboarding using something like app queues, or maybe you want to dig in with A/B testing or heat mapping to get a better sense of how they're walking through your platform. And then you add a product analytics tool like Mixpanel to analyze how all of these updates have affected customers and how they use your product. As you grow and scale, the integrations increase, and the people in your organization who need to instrument them become extremely distributed. They use different methods, different schemas to track data, and so engineers are spending time learning APIs and implementing one-off integrations for every single tool. It gets very complicated very quickly. And it's not just painful because of time, it's painful because the systems don't speak to one another. So to sum it up, most companies end up letting the tools they use define the customer data that they know and use. The tools dictate where the data lives and becomes a resource-intensive mission to get to the point where you can really know your customer or make it for product decisions. What's worse is none of these data pipeline issues help you to create a competitive advantage for your business. So here's one way you could solve it. Your data collection starts on the left from a variety of sources, including your website, mobile app, servers, third-party tools. And once it's funneled through Segment, you have the ability to make sure the data is clean and accurate, compliant with data regulations like GDPR or CCPA, before leveraging it for personalization or audience management. This data can be further filtered before it gets federated to more than 300 downstream data and email marketing tools. So your marketer can start looking at data for a campaign, your PM can keep track of an adoption funnel for her product, and your BI team can start analyzing data in your warehouse. In this new world, you've instrumented Segment once, And you can now use all your data centralized in one place and federate it down to any tool in a few simple clicks. So it brings the entire CDP toolkit into one easy to use software so all your teams can get much more value from customer data. 20,000 companies ranging from high growth startups to global enterprises have battle tested Segment, and we're about to hear from one now. But before I hand it off, just one more reminder to please use the Q&A function for submitting questions, upvoting, or chat. And now I'm thrilled to answer some of your questions at the end. So we'll start by welcoming Jazz Broughton, who's a CSM at Mixpanel, to walk you through their ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Taylor. So Mixpanel is a part of this data story that we're telling this evening. You know, we were designed to democratize data across the organization. And simply put, we're a self-serve product analytics tool, which is designed to enable product teams, marketing teams to quickly understand their user behavior. So it's about taking in that usage data at one end and then turning it into actionable insights through powerful tools and reports that you can engage with within the Mixpanel platform itself. But the whole thing that excites me about our conversation this evening, and especially hearing from Bella, is, you know, that insight is only as good as the data that you actually put into Mixpanel. Right? The hygiene, the cleanliness, the clarity of it, being really focused on it is a huge reason why we love being part of a tech stack that includes Segment. Because as you can see in this diagram, it really sits right in between all of those tools and plays so nicely to make sure that each tool, Mixpanel included, gets what they need in terms of that clean and consistent data. So that's our part of the story. I'd like to hand over to Bella, who's going to jump into how Tray.io is driving retention with customer data.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take over the screen now from Taylor. So Taylor, I'm now requesting remote control. And here we are. So thanks so much for having me. My name's Bella. I run the product team at Tray.io. And this kind of graphic gives a nice summary of what the Tray.io platform is. So we're a general automation platform. And we enable business users to create mission critical automation through that data that they collect, right? So we have two kind of key parts of our platform. The first one is connectors, which are essentially a wrapper around an API. So Taylor talked before about all the different tools downstream that you can use. And we have connectors that allow you to interact with all of those different tools in a kind of like seamless, sustainable and consistent manner. And then we allow you to utilize our sort of our graphical workflow builder interface to pull these connectors together in a sort of logical business process fashion to create automation between the different data that is sitting in all of these different tools and to automate processes at scale. So because it's a drag and drop interface, it allows different types of users to create integrations that they previously perhaps would never have been able to do because primarily that wouldn't have sat within their remit. So if we kind of look at the next slide, what this shows is the different types of users who actually interact with our platform. So there's a really broad range of personas that utilize the Tray platform. And that actually posed an interesting kind of product problem that Jazz and I are going to get into in a moment. When you have such a broad range of user personas, it actually makes it quite difficult to think about what are the user journeys that really matter and how quickly might some users move through those and complete certain kind of KPIs or key metrics faster or slower than other types of users, and is that necessarily an indicator of success or not? So that kind of led us to create a sort of new product analytics framework that we're now going to get into. So I've kind of termed this like our road to Oz, right? You know, it's always an ever evolving journey into the sort of product analytics utopia that every product person is trying to get to. And these are kind of the three key core components that I was really focused on when I looked at basically our product analytics stack and our product analytics strategy. And kind of, it was very clear to me that it really needed to evolve based on the hypergrowth that our own company had gone through, which had led to a really broad segment of users within a very short period of time that all had actually quite different needs from our platform. So the first thing is we really wanted to improve our sort of experience for users and to understand our users better in order to kind of utilize that data to retain them and make them really, really successful across what was a burgeoning product portfolio, which is pretty challenging when your product portfolio goes from kind of one product line to multiple within a very short space of time. I wanted to also make sure that that data was easy to access for all of the different people who needed it, right? So like Jazz talked earlier about how Mixpanel really democratizes the ability for different types of users within an organization to access product data. And that was definitely something that was keenly felt by me. We needed to allow everybody to easily access and analyze the data without having to make a request to our data analytics team, which, as you can imagine, for a sort of hypergrowth company, are often underwater. And then we wanted to create a really kind of sustainable and scalable strategy for the future so that we didn't kind of have to totally remake the strategy, even if the sort of implementation of it was continuing. We wanted to have a kind of strategic vision over where we were going so that that would kind of scale with our growth. And we wanted to have a really focused sort of pinpoint on what success actually meant for us and for our users. And that took a bit of time to define. So first of all, why did we kind of need to do this framework particularly? So folks who may be on the call who manage a tool that doesn't fit neatly into these kind of nice boxes of product manager perfect KPIs will empathize with this. If you think about an automation and integration platform, actually some of the traditional metrics might not actually hold true. So, you know, monthly active users or number of logins per week actually kind of success. If you've built an integration, continually need to log in, is that necessarily a good thing? Perhaps not. And as kind of Jazz talked about before, we're all about democratizing our tools, right? So that we can allow people to access technology that perhaps they hadn't been able to previously. And we wanted a North Star to kind of measure that, whether we were making progress towards that goal of democratizing the ability to build integrations and automate processes. And we knew that for our tool in particular, it can be quite technical for folks who've never used an integration platform before. And we wanted to measure the sort of steepness of that curve and to almost kind of flatten it a bit and to get a bit more predictable, right? So that we could know in advance, what are the types of users that we retain really well? What are the users that actually need more love, as it were, when we're trying to get them really successful on the tool? And thinking about the value that users are actually getting and whether we can be a bit broader, a bit deeper, and a bit more strategic on how we measure what kind of value is. You know, what is the pain point that our tool is solving for our users? So that's kind of why. And then how we were trying to do this before, I'm not going to spend loads of time on, but, you know, to Taylor's point earlier, it was symptomatic of that like burgeoning stack, right? We had lots of different product tools that I'm sure lots of people will recognize on this slide. So we do use LaunchDarkly, AppQueues, Full Story, Slack, Intercom, Segment, and we had a lot of data points, but we weren't necessarily being strategic around where that data was going and how it was being utilized. And what we turned to was essentially building out and being kind of focused across our product portfolio. So you can see here our Tray platform, and then our two education tools, the Tray Academy and our documentation platform, and saying, okay, let's join the data points and the touch points that are collected across this different product portfolio and use them to kind of create a more well-rounded view of what our users are actually doing. So we came to two things. The first thing was impersonation. I'll focus on that for 2 seconds before I then move into the user score, which has all the meat in it. But you need to understand impersonation before we understand user score. So I think most folks on the call will have an understanding of something like impersonation in their company. So, you know, when you can go into a user's instance of your platform, and I know Jazz has actually done this for us a few times. She's our CSM. We thank the stars every day, pretty much, that she's out there to help us. And she can kind of go into our Mixpanel instance and say, okay, this actually wasn't feeding through correctly, or I've turned on some of this kind of like hygiene alerts to make sure that you know what data is coming through in the lexicon area of Mixpanel. And we have the exact same thing in Tray. So we call it impersonation, and it's when maybe a member of customer success, perhaps in the implementation team or a customer success engineer, might go into a user's instance of the Tray platform and build something out for them, help them troubleshoot something, do a screen share, etc. And we knew that impersonation was actually a really key determinant of whether users were successful or not. So essentially, although I'm kind of simplifying a little now, the less impersonation a user had in their account, i.e. the better they were at self-serving their sort of automation and integration needs and the workflows that they have built, the less at risk they were. So conversely, in the kind of second bullet point, if a customer only builds 20% of the time that they're actually in the platform and the other 80% is actually someone impersonating on their behalf, they're much more at risk. So that fed into our user score. So our user score is a whole model. It's kind of one data point. It's one sort of key, not data point, it's one kind of key number that we attach to each user, and it takes in impersonation and 3 other areas. And I'll go into those now. So this is kind of what it looks like in the wild. So this will be Jazz and I talking about how she's helped us build out our user score in reality. I've made it sound really nice and easy previously, and she's going to illustrate just how hard it actually was for both of us. But the kind of key aim, right, was to track these user journeys across our product portfolio, across the different areas that we could collect data about our users, and specifically use it to drive retention and to drive efficiency. So Jazz, let's talk it through. So this is the user score model. I'm going to go over it. Jazz, if you wanted to ask any clarifying questions, please do. Yeah. So let me start at the top. There are 3 key sort of pillars to what we created as the ultimate sort of user score model. So our user score essentially is the North Star metric that I talked about before, that we landed on as kind of the key thing that we wanted to use to evaluate our progress towards, are we flattening that curve of the steepness of the learning curve? And are we making it easier for users to access this type of technology, integration and automation? So there's kind of 3 parts. First of all, engagement. So that kind of does what it says on the tin. And you can see here that we've got all of these new data points after this analytics strategy. So we've got the Academy, which we talked about before was our kind of education tool. And we've also got things here like hours updating. So that is whether users are updating their workflows, perhaps making them more efficient, perhaps adding additional logic, perhaps adding things like error handling. And then we've also got documentation, whether it was viewed in the last 3 months, and then a little bit on logins. And then these kind of 2 gray areas were data points that we actually reworked. So we changed the weighting of how meaningful these were for our engagement score. And then there was one piece that we actually deprecated, which was our old way of measuring impersonation. Workflow updates became kind of irrelevant because we had this new impersonation model. Value obviously is, a difficult one to measure actually, and we really struggled here because how do you measure the value of an integration or an automated process, right? Like it so depends on what that is actually doing. Is it lead routing? Is it lead to account matching? Is it actually bulk updating of your Salesforce instance? There's so many different things that actually have different value to a business. But what we landed on was the number of services used. So we use the term services to denote different SaaS applications, be they Redshift or Intercom or Slack or Mixpanel or Marketo. And then the tasks is the API calls. So like how much are you using those different services? And then what are the number of workflows that are actually doing that process? I'm aware that I'm talking a lot. So Jazz, any questions on either of those two?
No, I absolutely love this. And when I first saw this user score model, I jumped for joy. The Mixpaneler in me jumped for joy. The customer success manager in me jumped for joy, because I think especially when you have such a nuanced user base, having a score model can be so, so helpful. And if you have tools like Segment gathering that data in a reliable way, and then a tool like Mixpanel, there's actually no reason why you can't translate these into really easy, accessible reports to get all of these touch points. I think, and you described it as a framework, it's exactly that. Sometimes I know when we work with customers, frameworks, everybody's mind just goes, poof. But really it is sitting down and doing what you've done and thought, what are all the meaningful touch points that these users and customers actually have with us? How are we tracking them? Where are we tracking them? Great, we've got that baseline. What do we want it to look like? Or what has it historically looked like in our most successful customers? So I love the fact that it's clear from these, you've looked across everything. I think one thing that people may not realize is that Academy kind of sits by itself. I think even in the comments, somebody mentioned looking at videos in Segment University. It's a similar type of space with a different feel, with a different experience, but it's still being included. Like it's still part of the ecosystem. It's still part of providing that value. So I guess I wanted to know, because it sounds really simple, how long did it take for you to put this together in the first place? Because Tray is a nuanced product, and it can be used differently by different people.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'd love to say that it was sort of, a day's work to think about, oh, these are the different touch points that we have, and this is how they should be weighted differently. Obviously, in reality, it was probably off and on actually about 6 months, which I think might be a little bit intimidating for some people. But I think that we essentially, from a practical standpoint, me and members of the data team and another member of the product team that was really interested in this met every week. And we just basically inched our way towards iterating towards what we knew would be the most predictable. So I'll just kind of spend 30 seconds explaining what I mean by that. What we were really struggling with was that sort of predictability, like what makes a really good, retained, engaged, successful, value deriving user, and how can we backwards plan to essentially like get more predictable on who fits into that bucket and what does that bucket look like, and how can we encourage more people to go into that bucket, right? Instead of kind of just getting to the point where users would retain, would say that they love Tray, would go and evangelize on kind of Twitter or Reddit or any other sort of platform out there. G2 crowd is full of people evangelizing how amazing Tray has been for their business. But we only knew about it at the end, right? We wanted to know about it so much earlier, and to say, what are the factors that get users to this kind of really happy, this happy place where Tray's having a huge impact on their business. And that for us was the key driver of why we wanted to be so thorough on all of these different touch points. So essentially what we did is we looked across, as we said, the product portfolio and said, where does engagement show and where should it show and how much should we weight it? So what this actually doesn't illustrate, this schematic, is that these different sort of cards, as it were, or tiles actually have different weightings. So there's a lot of data crunching that goes underneath this, and it doesn't have to be that way, right? You can start back of a napkin, or as we say, back of a fag packet in the UK, but we're not going to say that here. And we can then say, okay, let's get a little bit more granular, let's weight things a little bit better. So for example, the academy visited is not necessarily worth as much as academy course completed, right? You know, you've just visited, using the segment example, segment university, but if you've completed multiple courses, which sometimes is 19 lessons, really kind of engaging with that content and coming back and returning and then trying it out, that means a lot more, right? And, you know, number of services used is important for value, but it's not as important as 1 month tasks, because actually if you're using maybe 1 or 2 services, but you're using so many tasks, that shows that you're getting a lot of value. And just so that we don't take up all our time on this slide, capability score is something which is incredibly important to Tray. For those on the line who have maybe a product which requires people to get to grips with some concepts that perhaps they may have never done so before. So, you know, Tray is a really, really powerful product. It's also incredibly flexible, and it requires users to have some grasp of software development concepts. You know, you need to understand sometimes what, you know, a loop is, and if you don't break that loop, what happens, and, you know, understanding branching and logic that allows you to build out really sophisticated processes, but it requires a level of understanding that perhaps you haven't had if you've never used an automation platform before. So capability is really important to us, like how proficient are users at building workflows and how complex can those workflows get that they're able to build on their own. So all 3 of those kind of pillars make up our user score, which, as I said before, is kind of one metric that we sort of assign to users, not in the platform itself, so users don't necessarily know what score they are, but it's really, really useful for us. So Jazz, I'm gonna keep going to look at our goals we created. Please. Okay, so this was kind of the first goal that we had. As I talked about before, impersonation and how much users are actually building for themselves, we worked out was a key component and sort of determinant of how successful they would be going forward in the Tray platform, and how they were likely to either renew their contract or not. So this was a goal that we landed on, which is to increase the proportion of users updating their workflows for more than 1 hour per month to 50%. And then we wanted in future to get that down to per week. And Jazz is going to talk us through what this actually looks like in Mixpanel. So Jazz, I'll just click through.
Yeah, amazing. So the first thing to know as we go through some of these examples, you know, there are maybe about 10, maybe a little bit more if we want to be detailed, different reports in Mixpanel. And its strength is that it gives you different perspectives on the same user and on the same data point. So the report that we're looking at the moment is actually our retention. And that's a report that would be used in Tray and will be used in Tray to essentially look at the people that are doing these repeat behaviors. So this is just one segment, but it's so important to understand, you know, new users, power users, segmenting those users, again, using the score. So using the insight, like it can get quite meta. Let's be real here. We're using that insight to go mining for some more insight. You know, I've got a group of power users. I've got people who are hitting the mark in terms of having more than 1 hour per month. Let me find more of those. Let me keep and track how consistent that is as well. You know, we're talking about repeated actions. To have the most impact, you have to keep doing the same thing over and over again consistently. Nobody wants to build a product where it's like, last month it was amazing, this month, meh. That is not how any of our business models work. So this is one great example of that.
Nice. Next. So as I said before, value and capability were really important in the user score model. So we wanted to basically say, okay, within the first 2 weeks of a new user joining the Tray platform and creating their account, how can we aim for them to be really successful as fast as possible within that 2-week period? And we landed on capability, so how complex the workflows were and the types of kind of integrations that they were building and automation processes that they were doing, as quickly as they could, and therefore getting a lot of value out of the platform really quickly. So we talked before about value using lots of different services. So were they just using Tray to get rid of one painful manual process, or are they actually using it throughout their team or perhaps their organization more widely? So that's how we landed on capability and value, and an average score of 120, which is a little bit irrelevant for this webinar, but just so you know, it's the real number, within their first 2 weeks. And Jazz, I'll just show what this looks like in Mixpanel.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
no.
This report is actually a snapshot of part of our funnels report, believe it or not. But this is one of the most powerful tools for really understanding what that key user journey is. You know, in conversations with Tray, we're talking about those first moments. And as much as 2 weeks is the window that's been decided, we can drill down into the first couple of seconds. Like, I guarantee you, especially for those of you that are Mixpanel customers, you can go into any one of your user flows and find an interesting group of people who have completed a journey that you thought would be like 5 minutes. We'll design it to be 5 minutes. We want you to read the text on the page. And they're doing it in 10 seconds. So this is where it becomes quite helpful, not only to see who is hitting that score, the pathway to it, but how long is that taking? Is there any particular reason for that? Are they coming from any particular source? Like, this is definitely a conversation for another webinar, but you know, we're finding a lot more. There are customers, we build for the customer who needs a lot of educating, but we want to make sure that we're not missing the customer who's super sharp. They are driven, you know, these are the customers that aren't necessarily on our radar in terms of data. They're the person who got told about it over brunch, went to the website, chucked in their card details, and then started saving time in life using Tray. Like, so looking at reports like this at a super high level, but also at a deeper level, is something that I always encourage people to do, and is definitely interested in Tray's results as well.
Yeah, and this kind of circles us back, right, to before when we were talking about why we needed to have a better grasp of our product analytics in the first place, and then obviously turn to Mixpanel in order to visualize them, is because we have such a broad user base that, you know, assumptions just cannot cut it when it comes to, oh, we think that most power users do these things or are able to do these things within this given time period. It's like, well, what does the data actually show, and how can we segment different types of users, right? So if you think about this, what it enables us to do is, you know, on Jazz's kind of slide here, you can see, okay, so 24% of users are not completing or are completing, etc. And then we could then sort of drill down and segment that even further and say, okay, what are the users that totally drop off and don't get anywhere near that score, and how can we almost kind of re-engage those users? And then we can speak to, you know, growth marketing, or we can speak to customer marketing teams to say, we need to create a campaign that actually re-engages these types of users and potentially points them very heavily in the direction of education materials, because using perhaps Full Story or another screen share tool, it's clear that they're really not getting it and they're not able to build anything that they find valuable at all, versus obviously, as you say, Jazz, like those users who are really, really savvy, find it really easy to work their way around the platform to build out something incredibly valuable really, really quickly. And actually, how can we perhaps serve those users differently in terms of in-app messaging, or in terms of email campaigns, or just email them and talk to them and say, hey, how did you pick this up so quickly, and understand that even better. And then kind of say, great, we've got this cohort of users who are really fantastic power users, and they're able to build out all of these really complex integrations. let's work with them to think about additional use cases. And then we're looking at expansion, right? And upsell and cross-sell into different teams. And that's where product analytics data can be so valuable, right? If you democratize it and use it to work with other teams in your company, not just within sort of the silo of product, though obviously product is a great silo to be in.
And I love that you mentioned that. I love that you mentioned have a conversation, because I think it's so easy for us to be in our tools and the numbers and then almost forget that behind that behavior is an actual user. You know, many of our companies have user research teams, we have focus groups, we have initiatives to understand customer stories. And these are all things that sometimes our marketing team are doing. These are teams that sometimes may not have access to the data. And that's why having those tools is so powerful, because your customer success team, your UX research team, your engineers can go in and say, right, I've got a list of a segment of users who have used this feature. I want to interview them for the second phase of that, and let the user's behavior nominate them for those opportunities and for those conversations, because they've already done the hard work. You know, the questions that you ask them and the answers that you get, amazing, like 10 times more than a blanket answer to say, hey, anyone want to talk to us about the new thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So finally, we talked a little bit about engagement. I feel like we've kind of covered this a little bit, but if you think about the broad product portfolio that some of us have, right? You know, it grows fast, especially in some kind of hyper growth companies. Trey is one where I've seen the demand for different ways of utilizing our platform kind of skyrocket. And so our product lines have kind of, more product lines have kind of emerged to serve those different needs. And with that comes obviously a broadening product portfolio that you need to understand the engagement across. And so this is something that was really important to include, to kind of increase that average engagement by 20%. And it's quite ambitious, but I purposefully didn't kind of segment that by saying of this type of user group or for this particular product line, but actually just to say, okay, we're going to blanket average engagement no matter where you started baseline wise, but let's push it up to 20% for almost everybody. And you know, the reason behind that obviously is pretty clear. You know, the more engaged users of an account are, and the data showed this in terms of predictability, the more likely they are to renew their use of Tray, and the less likely they are to churn as a customer. And we could kind of see that users heavily building, you know, and using different tools in our product portfolio, in this kind of suite of tools that they had access to in the months before their contract comes up for renewal, renew 93% of the time. So that's something that we really wanted to push on. And Jazz is going to talk us through what that looks like.
Yeah, so the image that we've popped up here is what a dashboard looks like on your computer and towards the right on the phone. We created an iOS app because we want this information to be at your fingertips. Like, we want you to be able to really understand how those trends are moving or not moving, because let's be real, we're having real conversations this evening. Sometimes things will plateau, so that you can click into that particular report from the dashboard and get a deeper view. But also, again, in terms of democratizing data, you can have these snapshots, again, super quickly, that can generate in a Slack channel, that can be sent out via email to key stakeholders who may not understand the nuts and bolts, but they need to know enough to know that that metric is actually moving. So this is the dashboard that we showed, and it has a few different reports. Our insights report, our funnel report is there, for instance. And again, you're able to slice and dice this information exactly how you want to, because what we emphasize is what you do in your day-to-day will impact your section of it. So if I'm talking to you and you work with one particular feature in the product or one part of your product, or again, if you're in a customer facing team, you have a region, you have a territory, what you do eventually feeds up to that executive level dashboard, right? Engaging 50% of your book of business, getting, you know, first week adoption of your new feature to 80%. trickles up to something so impactful. So we always encourage using dashboards to get that high level across the entire business.
Yeah, and that is especially useful when you're looking at sort of lots of different things at any one time, right? You know, you've newly released a particular feature that aims to decrease the time taken for users to achieve this particular flow, versus also we're looking at our sort of bread and butter key metrics like number of distinct workflows or things like that, and having that top level view is really useful to have. So let's finish up. Taylor, I think we're going to hand it back over to you.
Yeah, that was incredible. It's clear that the two of you have spent a lot of time thinking about this model and implementing it as well in Mixpanel. And it's great to see, you know, the way that you have reverse engineered success for a customer and what it looks like. And also I loved that insight, Jazz, you brought in around, you know, bubbling that up to the executive level, because I think that insight top to bottom is what really makes both successful product teams and successful products. So super insightful. Thank you so much for your time. And I want to kick it off with a question while I'm seeing some trickle into the Q&A. So be sure to add those if you do have questions for Jazz and Bella. But first, I mean, Bella, what do you wish that someone would have told you when you started to take on this journey of building out a user model? And, you know, what would you give as advice to anyone who wants to take on this journey themselves?
Yeah, I think what I wish I'd have kind of had if I had a sort of crystal ball to gaze into was the fact that you embark on something that you think has a sort of end point, and actually you learn that it's not about being done or it's not about being finished. It's always about kind of iterating and tweaking and adding more data points or including different things at a different weighting, and going back to the data and looking at the predictability, right, that I've kind of gone on about in terms of, does this actually show up in the customers that are renewing? Okay, no, it doesn't. We need to go back. We need to tweak it. We need to change it. Okay, this team needs access to this data. How can we get it to them? And, you know, it's just a constant sort of yellow brick road to the sort of utopia that you dream of, but it doesn't finish quite as soon as you maybe think that it might do. So I guess any advice to someone who's kind of embarking on a product analytics framework or journey is to not think of it as something that you're going to achieve in any kind of given time period, but actually that it's a different way of thinking about the way that you measure product analytics at your company. And it's about sort of feeding that way of thinking through into everything that you do, and collaborating with a lot more people in terms of bringing that thought process out into the wider world.
Yep, that makes a ton of sense. And I think, you know, one of the value propositions for something like Segment is that you will have this journey that changes. And as you scale, new needs come in, and being able to be flexible and modular in the way that you build your stack and in the way that you think about success, I think adds more value to your team and the teams that you support. So seeing this question coming in from Nick in the Q&A, and they're curious if you've combined your user score model with marketing or campaign data to identify which channels or campaigns produce the highest scoring users. And if so, anything interesting that you could share?
Yeah, so we actually have not done that yet, but it is absolutely something that we are on the way to doing. So just kind of last week, I had a meeting with our growth marketing team because they're looking at our trial process and looking at, okay, what makes a really successful trial user and how can we utilize different sort of campaigns or engagement models for different types of users in their kind of trial experience. And we talked about how the user score model would be really, really impactful there, so that they can look at, okay, users who are really, really capable at building, do they most frequently convert from trial to paid customer? And if so, what can we do to get more types of those users into the trial funnel, and how can we actually automate that? So that's something that we do really, really want to do. Another thing that we actually really want to do in terms of collaboration with marketing is actually identifying users who have a really high user score and what they're building on Tray, and actually kind of approaching them to think about how can they champion Tray in perhaps other areas that they are in, or other kind of forums, or perhaps do kind of case studies and things like that. So being a little bit more data driven from a marketing team approach to say, okay, you know, these customers are clearly really benefiting from Tray. They're shouting about Tray from the rooftops. Let's utilize that in our marketing material. And also thinking about like kind of partnership programs and things like that. If people have got a really high user score, or they're really engaged, etc., you know, surely those are the people to target for that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that as well, because this is definitely a use case that we see in Mixpanel, and it's a very powerful one. You know, in marketing, we tend to look at conversion, but in Mixpanel, we're seeing our customers and supporting them to look at people who retain, and then using our integration. So we have integrations with Facebook ads and Google ads to allow you to remarket or create lookalike audiences, all within GDPR standards, naturally, but lookalike audiences not only of people who have converted through that particular campaign, but who are demonstrating the behavior of a successful user, because that's what you actually want, because we're looking at long term. And some of the other things which was quite interesting with a different customer, looking at the retention report and being able to see that the channel that is giving the most retained users just so happens to be the partner that they pay the most for. So the ROI was there as well. When you start connecting your systems, when you start connecting your data and asking those questions, especially in growth marketing teams, the insight that you can get about who these users are and where they come from can be so powerful.
That's great. We are getting some great questions in the Q&A. One that I'd love to breeze through because it's a little more tactical, and Jazz, I'd love to get your opinion, but there's a question on tracking product use and requiring both the segment snippet and the Mixpanel snippet in the head. My perspective is you can always add the segment snippet and send that data downstream to Mixpanel, but Jazz, curious if you have any other best practices you'd suggest.
Yeah, if you have segment, please use segment. Bella can probably speak to it. You know, as the diagram that she noted there were data points that they stopped tracking. There were data points that they refreshed, that they checked, you know, and that was made so straightforward and easy through segment. Yes, it will still work, but it's so much easier. And ultimately then, if you have it right in segment, you can send it to any other tools that you have, including Mixpanel.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say what we found really useful with segment as an absolute hero in my team, who really kind of took it on and learned all about segment best practices, and basically kind of created a set of like guide rails, right? You know, when you're bowling, it's like, I want those rails up or I want them off. And I was like, up. And so what it then means is that everybody can utilize segment, can add their own events. Engineers know what the naming best practice is. We had kind of a really great automated process where we'd add kind of the Jira ticket with the segment event, and that would connect up with a G Sheet where we were kind of tracking, making sure that our instrumentation process was quite hygienic. And those were those guardrails, but it meant that any engineer could look at the process, any product manager could prioritize adding those segment events for new features and making sure that everything was instrumented correctly. And then we were speaking to Jazz on the Mixpanel side and saying, you know, is this data flowing in correctly? And if it wasn't, she could alert us, we could change things. But essentially it wasn't like one person had the keys to our product analytics. It was just like a clear guide rails. There was just clear guide rails that then anyone could use. So yeah, I would say big +1 on use segment.
Yeah, that actually feeds in really nicely to another question someone had around tips for democratizing data and getting people in general to use data more.
I saw that question. It made my sort of blood pressure go up, because we've all been there as a product team member where you're in conversations with stakeholders, and there are a lot of assumptions that kind of go flying around in businesses. And if you're not careful, those assumptions kind of get just sort of by osmosis taken as fact by the entire company. It's not thankfully happening where I am now, but it's definitely happened in my career in the past. And I would say that what I found really useful is just making a point of frequently walking through, potentially with product marketing, like where are we winning, where are we losing, for example, when we're thinking about net new customers, and the same with customer success. Who are the customers who are coming up for renewal? Okay, let's pull up the product analytics that we have about those customers, and really sometimes hand-holding stakeholders through this process and saying, hey, let's look at the number of workflows on the tray, in the tray instance, for example, the number of workflows that they've created recently. Let's look at the amount of tasks that they have. And then what we've focused on, and this is very much from a data analytics side as well, the data analytics team at Tray have been fantastic at doing this. Let's get that product analytics data into internal tools, right? So that it's not a case of I need access to Mixpanel, or I need to have a product manager or a data analytics person walk me through this data. But actually we've focused on getting that data into, everyone has an internal admin console or whatever. We have something that we call the admin app that shows all of our users, their organizations, and allows a kind of self-service various actions. And we wanted to get that product analytics data collected, obviously using the user score and using segment, and feed that into that admin app so that it's almost impossible to ignore. So I guess in summary, what I would say is make it impossible to ignore, put it in places where stakeholders look anyway, as opposed to saying, oh, you need to look in this new tool, or you need to look in this new place in order to get that data. Put it where they already look. And then also be patient, let's put it that way. Be patient, hold their hands, and just show it really frequently and really often is what I would say. Jazz, anything that you've seen work really successfully?
Yeah, I think I echo everything you say. And I think this is something that I always start with. Go in there with a motive, right? If I use the metaphor of going shopping without a list, going shopping without realizing anything that you want, you are more likely to leave that store with stuff, but it's just stuff. Like if you go into a tool like Mixpanel and you go in with no motive, I've just been told to use this thing, nobody told me why or how or what I'm going to get out of it, you're going to click X on that window being like, meh, that was a waste of my time. I just saw lots of numbers and really pretty visuals, hats off to our design team, but no insight that you can take action on. So when you are introducing people to tools and to data in general, Mixpanel or not, always be sure to answer the question, what's in it for me? What's in it for you? And that's extremely powerful for tools that can be accessed and are helpful to every team across the organization. It's the same with Tray. So many different personas can unlock it, but different things. So if I send you all in with the exact same onboarding flow or with the same information, you're more likely to give me that meh response. However, if I say, right, this is your role, and again, that there's an element of assumption in it a little bit, or having a conversation with one person in that team to say, I want to show you this, and I want to have an open conversation about what you would need or what you find most interesting. So when we invite the rest of the team, I'm saying, here are the top 3 reports that your colleague recommends you use. And the power of the hyperlink is an important thing. If you're pushing information into your native tools, into the tools that people are used to, make it easy for people to be curious. For us, we've seen this with our Slack integration. Throwing Mixpanel reports into channels where the whole company's there, and this visual report shows up with something trending up and to the right. You want to make sure that when people click it, they can go straight in to answer any questions that they want to. They know that it's real. They know that it comes from somewhere. So try and be tailored in it. And I think just remember that democratizing data is a verb. Like it's a verb, it's a doing thing. It's in this meeting, are we democratizing the data, or did I just reel off a list of numbers that people can't dig into? And I said, anybody got any questions? And everybody's eyes are glazing over. Like, it's something that we have to check in on, because it's going to be different for every person, in the same way it is with our users. The same way it is. Two people can get the exact same email and get different things, different learning styles, different motivations. That's a huge thing. So just be wary of that.
Absolutely love that. And this may be our last question. Thank you so much to everyone for all the wonderful questions, super thoughtful discussion, and any advice from anyone here on how to pick a leading indicator that correlates with retention. My answer is it's going to be super different dependent on your product, but curious to hear everyone's thoughts.
Jazz, do you want to go first? I feel like
I've
gone
blow it up a little bit. I get worried when people want one leading indicator. My thoughts only, not Mixpanel thoughts. Your users evolve, okay? And let me unpick what scares me about having one leading indicator. Your product evolves. There's lots of different touch points and different motivations. So even if you have a leading one, and Bella will tell you this, when we do a framework, we want you to have a focus metric. If that's increasing engagement, if that's driving daily active users by a certain number, that's absolutely fine, but build that out. Augment that with the different touch points to make sure that you're not missing something. Because again, 2 users, exact same platform, different behaviors, different motivations. To one customer, logging in once a month is enough. The CFO, logging in once a month is enough. Whereas the person who is actually your ideal persona, the person you sold to, them jumping in every week is not even enough for them. So make sure that you are capturing all of those users at those different levels, with an array of metrics. So that's my, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would echo that. Obviously, as this kind of webinar has shown, that's what we've done. We've kind of tried to tread the line between doing both, actually. So obviously we wanted the user score because I really wanted one sort of North Star to say, are we making progress towards our vision, right? Our vision of allowing users to build out integrations between tools that they use and to automate manual processes that they do. And can they do that no matter whether they're an IT specialist or someone with a computer science background, or whether they're someone in the marketing team or the sales ops team who wants to spend a lot of time building out a specific lead routing or lead to account matching process. And so that's why the user score for us is kind of our North Star, in terms of if users are getting higher, and as Jazz kind of said, like if the average user score is trending up and to the right, we know that we're making progress. And also it's kind of a simple North Star for everyone to get around. The higher the user score, the better. Now, that's the answer that I'll give when people are asking for a simple answer. But obviously throughout this webinar, beneath that user score is 3 pillars. And within those 3 pillars are multiple different touch points that are all actually weighted differently. Some mean more than others. So I'd say that it's about picking what does success look like for your users. So for me at Trey, it's users getting better at using our tool and building workflows and being engaged across our product portfolio and getting value out of our tool. And then kind of backwards planning to say, how can I turn all of the data that I have and that I'm collecting into an aggregate that then feeds up into that score that shows what success is for our users. And I think that it's about that aggregating of data that hopefully we've helped with across kind of tools like Tray and Segment and Mixpanel. We've shown how you can aggregate and visualize and collect that data. But I think only you really know what success looks like for your users and what retention is in terms of predictability.
Yep, I think that makes perfect sense. Wanted to take some time and thank you both, Bella and Jazz. I could listen to the two of you talk about these problems for hours. It's incredible to see the synergy and clear collaboration that you've both had with one another to make a best-in-class system for Tray. So thank you so much. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. We'll follow up with you over email if you've asked it, where we can get that information. And thanks again. Really appreciate everyone's time today.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.